Thank you, everyone. I'm really looking forward to this session. I'm sure you are too. I've often wondered why it is that some of the best, cheapest solutions to environmental and sustainability problems are the last ones considered by the political process. We have an extraordinary panel to begin to answer that question, a set of people that I think have never been on a stage together before, and so this is a real treat. Part of the underlying reason, I think, is that conservatives and progressives both have similar historical roots. Both of those movements were formed to break apart concentrated power. Conservatives, dating back to the Founding Fathers, to break the power of an overreaching government. Progressives, dating back to Teddy Roosevelt and before, to break an overreach of corporate power. Today, it is relatively easy to play those two biases in order to drive public spending on behalf of private interests. It is easy to sell a big spending package, a big tax cut, by crafting a narrative that speaks to, on the left, issues of fairness and justice, protecting people against corporate profiteering, or by nesting it in a narrative on the right about business growth, about military strength, and about national security. The consequence of that is to drive consumption without necessarily driving the creation of value to pay for that consumption. We do it in many ways. The consequence of that is that we have multiple deficits. Dual deficits is the topic of this panel. We face an economic deficit, and we also face a social ecological deficit. And we tend to deal with one of these deficits by making the other one worse. Consequently, the right is right. We are out of money and deep in debt. According to the Treasury Department at the end of last year, total national debt was about $51 trillion. About a fifth of that was the formal national debt. Veterans were owed $6 trillion. Social Security was about $9 trillion in deficit, and Medicare over its life about $25 trillion in deficit. So we face enormous financial deficits. At the same time, the left is also correct. We cannot pay off our debt by extracting it from the poor, extracting it from the middle class, or extracting it from the environment. The debt, in financial terms, equals about the entire combined net worth of all American households, from the top 1% through the 99%. It would be impossible to bring down spending enough to pay that debt off in even a generation, maybe even 2 generations. The only way we can avoid a very hard fall is to grow sustainably, not on the illusion of growth through consumption, whether you're driving straight consumption through Keynesian or through ecological overreach, but through innovation. Today we have a fabulous panel to explore this arena, and an extraordinary group of experts that are joining us today. We have James Hansen. James is director of NASA Goddard Space Center. He is one of the world's foremost climate scientists, famously stood his ground against political pressure to advance his views on climate. He's replacing Sephora Berman, who was going to be with us this morning, but she's Canadian, and apparently related to her activities on oil sands, she's been denied access to the country for our event today. So James has graciously stood in on her behalf. We have Rob Shapiro, the chief economic advisor to Bill Clinton in his campaign days, the Undersecretary of Commerce under the Clinton administration, co-director of the Climate Task Force, and one of the nation's premier economic analysts. We have Jeff Farmer, the director of organizing for the Teamsters and a real leader in the movement to drive the creation of green jobs, sustainable jobs. We have Chris Lamb, Director of Social Responsibility at Mosaic, one of the companies that is seeking to close the global food and water gap. We have Scott Griffin from the Chief Sustainability Officer at Greif, the leader in industrial packaging. He's the man who inspired waterware, which is used by women and children in the developing world to reduce the burdens of carrying water. And of course, we need no introduction for Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., one of the nation's leading environmental advocates, the founder of the Waterkeepers Alliance, and one of the people who is bringing the issues of internalizing costs in the free enterprise system most forward. I'm going to start with one question, and I'm going to toss it to Bobby Kennedy to answer, and that is basically, what is the problem? What's the problem of the dual deficits?
Well, first of all, let me say this. In addition to being an advocate for NRDC for 30 years and for the Waterkeeper movement, I also, for the past 9 years, have been a partner in the biggest clean tech venture capital firm in the country, which is Vantage Point, and probably the most successful and profitable one. And so I've seen, I've dealt both in the business domain as well as the environmental advocacy domain. And what I would, I think the lesson that I've learned is that in 100% of the cases, good environment, one of the mantras of the big oil companies, the big polluters and their indentured servants on Capitol Hill, is that we have to choose between economic prosperity on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. That is a false choice. In 100% of the situations, good environmental policy is identical to good economic policy. If we want to measure our economy, and this is how we ought to be measuring it, based upon how it produces jobs and the dignity of jobs over the generations, over the long term, and how it preserves the value of the assets of our community. If, on the other hand, we want to do what the big polluters have been urging us to do, which is to treat the planet as if it were a business in liquidation, convert our natural resources to cash as quickly as possible, have a few years of pollution-based prosperity, we can generate an instantaneous cash flow and the illusion of a prosperous economy, and we can make a few people billionaires by impoverishing the rest of us. But our children are going to pay for our joyride, and they're going to pay for it with denuded landscapes, poor health, huge cleanup costs that are going to amplify over time, and that they'll never be able to pay. Environmental injury is deficit spending. It's a way of loading the cost of our generation's prosperity onto the backs of our children, onto the poor who shoulder the disproportionate burden of environmental injury. And one of the things I've done over the past 30 years as an environmental advocate is to constantly confront this argument that an investment in our environment is a diminishment of our nation's wealth. It doesn't diminish our wealth. It's an investment in infrastructure. The same as investing in telecommunications or road construction. It's an investment we have to make if we're going to ensure the economic vitality of our generation and future generations. The last comment I'd make is, and this probably goes to what we're going to talk about later, is that I'm a very strong advocate of free market capitalism, and I believe true free markets are really the answer to our environmental problems. True free markets that force us to force all the actors in the marketplace to internalize the costs of bringing their product to market. It's the externalization of those costs that causes pollution and causes all kinds of other injuries to our society. And the free market is the most powerful economic engine that's ever been devised. But it has to be harnessed to a social purpose. And if it is not, it's going to just carry us down the road to oligarchy and to global apocalypse, and that, I'll stop there and give my colleagues a chance to talk.
Terrific. Well, Rob Shapiro, you helped President Clinton preside over a period of, I think most people see it as quite a successful period of economic growth and sustainability. How do you see this? How do you see the two deficits?
Well, the deficits are clearly related at lots of different levels. One is that when you have a large budget deficit, the first thing that suffers is your ability to make investments in things which you're not investing in now. The deficit is crowding out environmental investments, social investments, education investments. The second is that, and as a long-time Washington advocate of carbon taxes for climate change, it's the fundamental problem we confront in it, and that is, while I agree with everything Robert said, these are long-term investments, and in the short term, it means higher energy prices for everyone. And you can only sell that kind of approach if the economy is very strong. If people, in effect, have excess resources to absorb that burden. You know, in all the history of the U.S. democracy and the European democracies, one of the lessons is it's very, very hard to get people to accept a short-term cost in order to achieve a long-term benefit. That's kind of the model of Social Security or Medicare. It's virtually impossible to get people to accept a short-term cost in order to avoid a larger long-term cost. We just don't have an example of it, except in the financing of war. And that's the political challenge we face with respect to climate and other fundamental environmental challenges, that we cannot sell it simply as we must do this as an insurance policy, because at some point in the future, which we cannot specify, terrible things will happen to the planet and to our children, but which we also cannot specify. This is a political problem. It has nothing to do with the science of it. And this political problem is made much more serious if average people, if the majority of the country are seeing their incomes decline or stagnate, as they have for the last 12 years, that is since President Clinton left office, than if there is a sense of excess resources because of fast rising incomes. This says nothing about the legitimacy and the correctness of any of these arguments. It's a fundamental political reality which we have to figure out if we're going to advance these the policies that I think everyone on this stage agrees are critical.
Well, James Hansen, you've been thrown into the political process. You're a career scientist, but have been brought in, to the political process in difficult ways. You've been trying to grapple with this, with the need to develop political consensus to move forward. What's the problem from your perspective?
Well, okay, we're jumping to the solution. I guess we all agree that there's a long-term climate problem if we continue on the path that we're on. In fact, the science is crystal clear that we cannot burn all of the fossil fuels without creating a situation that is out of a climate change situation that's out of control of future generations. But let's, since we started talking about the economics, let me say that it's true that you cannot, it's very difficult to impose a tax during a time when there's such economic difficulties as now. But the basic problem, as Bobby made clear, is that we are not making the fossil fuels pay their true cost to society. We're actually subsidizing them. And furthermore, they don't have to pay for the health impacts of air and water pollution, and they don't have to pay for the climate impacts that will affect especially our children and grandchildren. So the way to solve this problem would be to put a gradually rising fee on carbon emissions, which you must collect at the source so that it's a flat fee that covers all fossil fuels. You collect it at the domestic mine or the port of entry. And that money, in order to make this acceptable to the public and in order to allow the fee to continue to rise over time, the money that is collected should be distributed to the public on a per capita basis, so the person who does better than average in limiting their fossil fuel use will get more in the monthly dividend, which can be distributed electronically to their debit card or their bank account. That approach would allow, with the current distribution of energy use, 60% of the people would get more in the dividend than they pay in increased prices.
You're saying, and this is this is one of those income redistribution systems. But what you're saying, that this is neutrality, that this is a revenue neutral approach.
And it lets the marketplace make the decisions. Instead of subsidizing different energy sources, let the market decide that. This is the conservative approach. You know, the conservatives, I think, need to understand that if we don't address this climate problem, at some point, the public is, when things get sufficiently obvious, there's going to be a demand for a solution. And it will be like Pearl Harbor, where suddenly the government, it takes over and says, you know, we're doing these things, like the government told Detroit it can't make cars anymore.
Yeah.
So this will be the impact on people's liberties that conservatives are most concerned about. So I think we can get a bipartisan solution if we can get, and I think it really needs to come from the conservatives, because it does need to be a market-based approach, not one in which we try to get the government to decide what the future energy should be. Let the marketplace make that decision.
Appreciate that, and I want to come back to that, to the politics. But first, I want to go to Chris and talk about this from your perspective. You come at from a food and a water perspective, and perhaps from an opportunity as well as a challenge perspective. What's the problem as you see it?
Well, when I look at dual deficits, to me, it's really largely driven by population growth. And we've got 7 billion people on this planet right now, and this planet wasn't designed to house and home 7 billion people. 1 billion people went to bed hungry last night. And when you consider we're going to have 9 billion people on this planet by 2050, you can see the problem that we have currently is going to get a lot worse. So one big challenge with these dual deficits is, how do we grow more food on our current land footprint? Now, there are some places in the world where we can slightly increase our land footprint, but for the most part, we're stuck with what we have. All of our prime arable land is already in production. And we have to be very careful about deforesting. Those forests sequester carbon, and that's very important for us. So it really is about more food per acre and more crop per drop. Water, obviously, is a very limited resource. We need water to grow food. Current projections would say that we'll have about a 30% shortfall in water at current demand levels by 2030. But it's not just about food and water, it's about resources in general. Like, just look around this room. Every single thing in this room ultimately came from the land. Stone, metal, wood, even the clothes in your bags. With 9 billion people around, those resources are going to become greatly constrained. There are a finite number of water molecules in our atmosphere. We can't simply produce more. And then throw in the one thing that Thomas Malthus didn't predict, climate change. Now you've got uncertainty added to all of that. We may still have the same number of water molecules, but they probably won't be distributed in the same way. Places that used to be wet may become dry. Places that used to become dry may become wet. I don't know if any of you know very much about farming, but that's not very good for farming practices. So really this is a simple case of supply and demand. We have far too much demand and not enough supply, and it's going to put great constraints on food, water, capital, energy, everything.
One of the things we have an ample supply of is people ready to work. And Jeff Farmer, I wonder if you can comment on how we can put some of the people to work doing some of the environmental and filling that deficit.
Well, you know, I feel somewhat like as a union organizer in the belly of the beast here in Wall Street. But I want to just, you know, tonight we're going to have a debate, and there's going to be a lot of talk about jobs. What there's not going to be a lot of talk about is income. And I just think that sometimes we're ignoring what is most prevalent in front of us. And every day we pick up the paper and we read about, you know, the 6 Walton family heirs whose income or whose wealth is equal to 42% of the U.S. population, or that CEO pay is 343 times that of an average worker. And I think there's a number of reasons for that, and one, you know, very, very critically of our own labor movement is that we've allowed, you know, the percentage of union membership to decline. We've allowed, as a society, we've allowed the tax code to be simply, you know, become a mess and become very, very unfair. But I think fundamentally the problem is with extreme, you know, we have the greatest income equality now of any industrialized nation. The greatest income inequality since the robber barons of our time. So the interesting thing to me is that we're not out of money as a society. We just don't have access to the money that's been created. It's been appropriated by the extremely wealthy, and we've allowed that to happen. So what are the ramifications of that? Well, all the things that have been mentioned. We have an inability to invest in infrastructure. We're not bold with our solutions. We're not engaged in public purposes, and it limits our vision. So as Bobby said, it presents us with these fatal false choices between jobs and the environment. Mm-hmm. So it seems like fundamentally to our future as a society and to grappling with some of these incredibly pressing environmental issues, we need the resources to be mobilized for this cause. And I believe one starting point really has to be to take a serious look at the income inequality in our society. Our union has tried on a number of occasions to deal with this false dichotomy between jobs and the environment. Perhaps I can talk about those a little bit later, but there are things that can be done, but we need to be bold and we need to be strategic.
Now, Scott, I want to come back to the issues of income inequality as well, but Scott, from a business opportunity perspective, you're active with WBCSD. What's your thought on the dual deficits?
Sure. So, thank you. Is it on?
Yeah.
Good. I would add that, and I appreciate the comments that are being made here. It's important that we open the aperture a little bit and consider the context of the global issues. Greif is a global company. We operate in 52 countries, 365 manufacturing assets. So it's interesting to hear the discussion on how you deal with carbon. Sometimes a corporate perspective may be more look at carbon from a consumption perspective versus a production perspective. There's just a tremendous debate. But from where Greif sits, we clearly see this as an opportunity. We see that the only real reason these deficits should persist is if we continue to take legacy solutions and try to employ them against new world challenges. Mm-hmm. And at Greif, we've done things like change the business model. Our old business model was producing units, and we've gone to a new business model where we try to maintain the useful life of the product. We keep it in use. 50 years ago, that would have not been an economically viable solution. Actually, now we've invested over $300 million in that business, and it's a quite profitable unit. And we've reduced our carbon footprint significantly by doing that. So what I would say is, from a business perspective, we're going to tackle it with innovation. We're going to tackle it with strategy, and we're going to have a real serious look at what we call sustainable consumption, mm-hmm. redesigning the business models.
Now, is it possible, given the current context, Bobby Kennedy talked about externalities and the need to internalize them for the free market to work. You're talking about innovation, changing the business model so that you have a longer-term perspective. Is it possible to get there without internalizing externalities, without law, Bobby?
I think you have to force industry to internalize their externalities. And let me just start by kind of contesting something that I think I heard from Bob Shapiro, which was that when we have high deficits, it makes it more difficult for us to find investment in the marketplace. I don't believe that. We've had higher deficits, for example, after World War II than we had now, when you compare it to GMP, and we got out of that by growing our economy. not by paying off the deficit, but by growing our economy. Well, and today, there's huge amounts of capital in the marketplace. They're just not being allocated rationally and to things that we ought to be allocating them to as a nation. To your issue of externalities, and this is connected, I believe, as I said at the outset, in free market capitalism, a true free market, which we don't have in this country, a true free market promotes efficiency. Efficiency means the elimination of waste, and pollution is waste. A true free market would encourage us to properly value our natural resources, the commons, the public trust assets, and it's the undervaluation of those assets that causes us to use them wastefully. In a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich and without enriching your community. But what polluters do is they make themselves rich by making everybody else poor. They raise standards of living for themselves by lowering quality of life for everybody else. And they do that by escaping the discipline of the free market. You show me a polluter, I'll show you a subsidy. I'll show you a fat cat using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay his production costs. Why is it that we as a nation are allowing an oil industry to dominate our political system so that we're borrowing $1 billion a day from nations that don't share our values in order to import $1 billion of oil a day, largely from nations that don't share our values, some of them which are outright hostile to us. We're funding, in essence, through our addiction to oil, both sides of the war against terror. We spend $100 billion a year on our military expenditures in the Gulf. Oil imposes all of these other costs, poisoning the Gulf of Mexico, poisoning Valdez, all of these other costs on our society, the health care costs, et cetera. Plus, we give them $55 billion a year in free subsidies through the oil depletion allowance and all these other loopholes that we've put in, that their lobbyists have put into the tax code. This is a mature industry that deserves no subsidies. If we want to give subsidies to an industry, we ought to be jump-starting industries that are in our national interest to start, not ones that are addicting us to foreign wars, et cetera. The thing that, right now we are in a position, in a really great position, to be able to even with these subsidies. I had lunch a couple of weeks ago with David Crane, who's the head of NRG, which is one of the biggest energy providers in our country. And he has coal plants, he has nuke plants, he has gas plants. And he said to me, the future is in solar. Because right now in 20 states, I can buy solar panels from my vendors and use those solar panels, install them, and produce electrons cheaper than I can at grid parity. So cheaper than any other of the incumbents. And he said within 5 years that this year, solar dropped 73%. It's dropping 35% per year. So even with these huge subsidies to the incumbents, the renewables are still beating them head-to-head in the marketplace. Yeah. And, if you got rid of the incumbents, those, we are paying for coal, for example. If you really added the subsidies to coal, they say coal is cheap and clean. We know it's a dirty lie when they say it's clean. It's also a lie when they say it's cheap. It's just the illusion of cheapness because of the huge subsidies and the externalities that they impose. It's really the most catastrophically expensive way to boil a pot of water that's ever been devised. Yep. If you force them to pay the true cost that they're imposing on our society, and that's what a rational free market system would do. It would say, we want everybody to act in the marketplace. We want entrepreneurship, but we are not going to allow you to force the public to pay your cost of production. If you want to bring a product to market, you pay the full cost of getting it there.
Rob, is that what a free market would do?
Well, I am of an age that it is really painful to disagree with Eddie Kennedy. I'm sorry. But the fact is, thank you for the fact is, we did drastically bring down the deficit after World War II because 50% of our spending was World War II, and we came into peace, and defense spending collapsed, and the deficit collapsed with it, and that freed up all that capital that went into investments that produced the growth that then produced, with the public investments and private investments, this period of really an unparalleled period in which income gains were relatively even for every income group for 30 years. It was a kind of unique period. The rich did not get richer faster than the poor got richer. And it was because of this democratization of public investment, particularly in education and in infrastructure, which was possible because for two reasons. One, because most of the burden, frankly, was on the top, because we had a much more progressive tax system then than we do today.
91% income
yes,
tax.
and fewer, we have a higher tax rate on high-income people today, but we say to them, but most of your income is not going to be subject to that, because most of your income comes from capital made in the environs of this building. I feel the moral urgency, as much as you do, Robert, about climate and about the environment. And I agree with you on the free market. The problem is, in order to get, and the justice that businesses should pay all of the costs of their production, which includes all of their externalities, which would include the health costs associated with it as well. I agree with that as an economist. I agree with that as a progressive. But the country doesn't see things as abstractly as we do. Most people are struggling, and have been struggling for at least a decade, with stagnating or declining incomes, with contracting health care coverage, with fast rising education costs, and now on top of that, the destruction of between a third and a half of their wealth, because the wealth of 80% of the country exists almost entirely in their home equity. And we spent $2 trillion stabilizing the financial markets, which was correct, but those are markets which create wealth for the top 10 to 15% of the country. The rest of the country depends upon increases in home values, and we spend virtually nothing on that. Yeah. And so the fact is, we have got to get the economy right in order to create the political conditions to make the case that we all, and also as a matter of social justice, we have to get the economy right. But with respect to climate and the environment, it is a precondition to sell even a tax shift that Jim and I agree on, and which I've been trying to sell, as he has, in Washington for 5 years at least.
There was another aspect of the post-war economy that should be factored in here, and that was the fact that you had a third of the workforce in the United States at that time who were under collective bargaining agreements, who had a voice in the job, who sat across the table from their employer negotiating. And that strong labor movement, where we represented a third of the workforce, that strong labor movement lifted everybody else up as well. It certainly lifted up the union members themselves, but as a result, non-union workers were also raised up. It was a very, very important factor. I think surprisingly enough, it actually works. It actually addresses what we're talking about today. Let me give you a quick story about the tale of two cities. San Francisco currently recycles about 75% of its waste. There's a company in San Francisco where we represent 1,200 workers. Those recycling workers they start out at $20 an hour. They have health care benefits. They have pensions. Contrast that with a company in Los Angeles called American Reclamation, where workers are still making minimum wage, digging through trash, recycling materials. It's feudal sweatshop conditions. If we're serious about the future of our environment, if we're serious about the future of the health and vitality of communities and the rights of workers, we need to factor that in. Workers need to have a voice in the job. They need to these new green jobs, we can create millions of green jobs, but if they're low-level jobs that have no future, or there's no income, real source of income, that's a recipe for disaster.
Is it a matter of since union membership is down, building union membership back up, making it easier to sign up employees to be members of unions? And when you say that we have enough money, it's just not distributed properly, is it just a matter of going in and redistributing that money? I mean, some on the right would differ from their interpretation of what you're saying.
Well, of course, but what we've been talking about here with the tax codes and various things is that we've been witnessing before our very eyes for years, for decades now, the redistribution of wealth in this country. So what we're saying is that I'm a card-carrying income redistributionist, but the fact is that there has to be a balance, and with a weak labor movement and weak labor laws and that counterbalance, that countervailing force is not there. And again, it's not just about proprietary union membership. It's about our ability to have a voice that acts kind of as a buffer to those who would want to.
So creating and is there a change in the labor movement? Since I was in college, folks from the labor community have been saying we've got to get more people in unions, and I look at it and I think, well, maybe the union needs to adapt to modern needs. Is there a need for the union community, for the labor community, to reconceptualize itself?
Oh, there's no question about it, and I believe we're doing that. Probably not as fast a pace as we should, but I think we should keep in mind that we have a labor law system, if you will, in this country, a labor policy that is so antiquated. It harkens back to the early days of the 20th century. There's somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15 million workers who are labeled as independent contractors. In many cases, it's a sham. It's just we have thousands or millions of workers who are temporary workers. So there's countless workers who are not covered by any kind of system of labor law or labor policy. They're essentially disenfranchised, if you will.
James Hansen, you're proposing an approach to internalizing externalities, which achieves some of this. Tell us a little bit more about.
Yeah, let me go back to we agree that there's a basic problem that if we burn all the fossil fuels, the planet is in trouble, and our children and grandchildren have a problem that they're not going to be able to solve. So then the question is, well, how do we change our energy approach to move to clean energies? And the problem that we have as we go from one administration to another, one administration will say let's subsidize clean energies, solar panels and windmills, and then we'll get a change of administration and we go back to not reducing those subsidies and continuing the subsidies of fossil fuels. That, and there are arguments as to whether are these clean energies going to provide baseload electric power. There are legitimate disagreements about that. And so far, fossil fuels are continuing to be the basic source of our energy. Almost all of our energy is coming still from fossil fuels. And we have governments all around the world going after every fossil fuel they can find, even extremely dirty ones like tar sands and tar shale. So the fundamental problem, as we have said, is that those fossil fuels are not made to pay their cost to society. And the way you must do that is you can't suddenly change the system so that you add all those costs onto them, because that would be a huge change and the economy would be in complete disruption. So you have to do it gradually. You have to gradually put a price on carbon emissions. Collect it from the fossil fuel companies and distribute the funds to the public. That would stimulate economic growth, and it would move us in the direction of clean energies, and it would let the marketplace decide which ones are really effective. But we have to change. right now we import food from New Zealand because there's no tax. There's no, the aviation fuels we agreed in the 1940s should be tax-free. Well, that continues. Once you get a subsidy, it's very hard to take that back. So we can import food from New Zealand. It makes no sense. We should, if we put this rising price on carbon, it will encourage the changes that we need in society, which it would favor nearby farms over New Zealand. It would discourage people from driving 100 miles to work in a jalopy that's getting 15 miles to a gallon. You have to make those changes. And it would be a progressive tax, in effect, because the person who owns 3 houses and flies around the world a lot is going to pay more, and that's fine. They should. But unless we do this very fundamental thing by putting a price on carbon that makes fossil fuels pay their true cost to society, we can't solve the problem.
So how do we get to that, or to any of the other solutions? I know that folks have areas of concern around water and food and so on. How do we get there politically? Are the Republicans ever going to support a tax or a tax shift? Are the Democrats going to advocate something that is low cost?
If I could say one thing for a second. I know it may appear crazy to import food from New Zealand, and you may think there's a very large carbon footprint there. But there are some externalities to consider. The greatest carbon footprint in the food system is actually the distance that people drive to buy their food. It's not necessarily the transportation of food itself. And the efficiencies that are necessary in the food system are not necessarily obvious. If you look right now, I'm sure many of you have Facebook pages. And at least my Facebook page is often dominated by, don't buy this food, don't buy that food. Can you believe what goes into this food? Can you believe what goes into that food? And we're mired in this kind of crazy discussion between conventional and organic, conventional bad, organic good. The truth of the matter is neither conventional agriculture nor organic agriculture are sustainable. Neither of them are. So what we need to do is we need some new combined models, and we need to look at things differently. Things are not always as they seem. The key here is sustainable intensification. It's absolutely maximizing what you get from every single acre of land. This can be done. We certainly need organic matter, and we certainly have to maximize organic matter wherever it's available. But we're talking about deficits here. A large part of the world doesn't have the organic matter necessary. We often think of organics here in the US. We look at our lovely lush fields. Try to go to a water-stressed part of India or a water-stressed part of Africa and see what kind of organic matter is around. So we want to try and maximize our use of organic matter, but also maximize our targeted use of mineral fertilizers and really use modern technology to grow safe, sustainable, and nutritious food. And that is going to take a completely new way of looking at things, and it's going to have to open some minds in Washington. I mean, we have a big election going on right now. Nobody's talking about the food problem. They're talking about big government and small government. I don't care about big or small government. I want smart government. And I want smart government to try and start addressing some of these huge issues that we're facing right now.
Bobby.
Let me just give you a couple of examples of success stories. I have a friend, Jim Rogers, who's the head of Duke Power, who has the second biggest coal fleet in the country. And he hates coal. He wants to, as James said, he wants to transition off of coal, but he needs somebody to rationalize the economy to allow him to take that step, because the way in 49 states, the way that CEOs of utilities and their shareholders make money is by burning as much energy as possible. So even though he wants to stop using it, his shareholders want him to get his customers to leave their lights on all night and to leave the refrigerator door open, because that's how they make money. So in California, in 1982, my group, NRDC, rewrote the rule in California so that CEOs of utilities make money not by burning more energy, but by encouraging their customers to conserve energy and by switching to renewables. They make the same amount of money, and their shareholders make the same amount of money, Pacific Gas and Electric, Southern California Edison, but they do it by doing good things for society, Right now, Jim Rogers has to wake up every morning and decide whether he's going to serve the interests of humanity, of his country, of the future of civilization, or whether he's going to serve his shareholders that day. And that's a really bad place for us to put the smartest CEOs and people in our country, where they have to make money by doing bad things to our country. So we changed the rule in California, and as a result of that, now in California, it used to be, and this wasn't a radical idea, because before we had dereg, CEOs of utility, if they wanted to build, the way they would make money is by building a capital asset and then billing their customers for it, their customer base. So they go out to the PUC, they'd say, we want to build a dam, it's going to cost $100 million. We want to integrate that cost into our rate base, here's our show of need, and they would stamp it, the PUC would stamp it approved, and they would go out and do it. Now in California, the head of the utility will go to the PUC and say, we want to rip out the Edison light bulbs from 1 million homes, we want to rip out the inefficient refrigerators, the inefficient boilers, and replace them at our expense, and then integrate those costs into our rate base. It's going to cost $100 million. We'll save 3 times the amount of money as we would make by making that dam, but we're going to do it by doing good things, and we want to build renewables. And as a result of that today, Californians use half the energy that anybody else in the country does per capita. Californians use 6,000 kilowatt hours per year. The rest of us use between 11 and 14,000, and that makes their state more competitive. One other example. One of our companies, BrightSource, is today building the biggest power plant in America, 2.7 gigawatt power plant. It's a solar thermal plant in the Mojave Desert. This is a mirror farm in the desert that heats up a turbine and produces energy very efficiently when the sun is shining. We have 20-year power purchase agreements with Pacific Gas and Electric in Southern California Edison. Bechtel is doing the construction. We're building that plant in 3 years. It takes 10 years to build a coal plant, 10 years to build a gas plant, 30 years to build a nuke plant. We're building it at a cost of $3 billion a gigawatt. A nuke plant costs $15 billion a gigawatt. A coal plant costs $3 billion a gigawatt, and a gas and oil plant costs $3 billion a gigawatt. But once you build our plant, it's free energy forever, because the photons are hitting the Earth every day for free. All we have to do is build the infrastructure to pick them up, harvest them, and put them into the grid. The government has to build a grid for us. Once you do that, private capital is going to flood into that area and make these things. Why? Because it's cheaper. If once you build that coal plant for the same $3 billion, now the big costs start, because now you got to cut down the Appalachians, ship them across the country in rail yards, burn the coal, poison every fish in America with mercury, which is, according to the National Science, every freshwater fish in America. Poison 1 out of every 6 American women with mercury, 270,000 children a year with mercury, kill 60,000 people a year, impose costs on our healthcare system of $75 billion a year from ozone and particulates, acidify, sterilize 1/5 of the lakes in the Appalachians. All of these other costs that come after you build that coal plant. Yeah. Once you build the oil plant, now you've got to go to Saudi Arabia, put a hole in the ground, bring out the oil, refine it expensively, genuflect to the sheiks who despise democracy and are hated by their own people, get in wars periodically that cost us $4.3 trillion, which is what OMB says this one's going to cost us. Bring it across the Atlantic with a military escort that, guess what, Exxon doesn't pay for, you and I do. Spill it all over the Gulf, spill it all over Valdez, burn it, and poison everybody in the country. Yeah. So the big costs happen after you build that plant. Once you build our plant, it's free energy forever. Last point, here's the math. We use 500 gigawatts at peak demand of carbon-based fuel in this country. At over 50 years, which is the life of the power plant, at 2% growth, we have to double that. So we need 1,000 gigawatts to completely decarbonize America. At $3 billion a gigawatt, which we can do, that's the same cost as wind and solar, we can do that, and we can do it really quickly for $3 trillion, which is less than the cost of the Iraq War, and we never have to get in a war in the Mideast again. So and we have clean energy, we save $345 billion, plus we pay for it in 2.5 years by getting rid of the $750 billion that we're sending out of the country to buy oil every year. It makes economic sense, and we have the capacity to do it now. It's not as easy as that, as I make it seem, but it's a lot easier than getting in a war in Iraq.
It's, you know, what has baffled me for a number of years, and it becomes clear, it should have been obvious to me a generation or two ago, why are the simplest solutions and the lowest cost solutions, you talk about, you know, a variety of solutions that cut costs, why are those the hardest politically to get through? And what we have seen, I think when Congress tried to deal with the climate issue, you saw this, a very simple Republican idea, cap and trade, becoming, in the minds of some, more of an opportunity to raise money and then distribute it to various political constituencies in order to do the pragmatic work of building the votes that you needed to get it done. One of the problems that Phil Howard talked about yesterday was that the barrier to many of these changes is, as he sees it, K Street lobbyists, the tendency for corporate government affairs representatives to just focus on using all of the corporate chits to protect and gain advantage in the political marketplace, not to use the corporate political power to advantage policies that are good for everyone. How, and I want to ask the folks from business, and you represent, or not represent, but you're engaged with World Business Council on sustainable development, Scott, how can we motivate companies to take a broader look and to break out of the pattern of staying away from controversial issues that lead to benefits for all and focusing all their marbles on protecting whatever advantages they may have in the marketplace?
Well, I mean, my comment is I believe the best companies are, and the best companies are winning, and I clearly see that. I would say that we're politicizing an issue that doesn't need to be necessarily politicized. I think great companies that I look at and that I see are moving way beyond the old vestiges of building businesses by establishing political barriers. They're moving very fast. So I'm more of an optimist. I believe that corporate actors are moving, and quite frankly, they're moving past this political discussion because we can't wait. The challenges that we have here domestically are even often greater than the challenges we face in the developing economies. And Greif is an old company, 136-year-old company, been around a long time, fourth continuously traded stock on the market. What I would say is, yes, we have issues of deficits here domestically, but let's not lose sight of the interconnectivity we have with the rest of the world. As we solve our problems, as we solve our issues, we can't lose sight of these challenges that's happening in other parts of the world like Haiti and in Africa. Great companies are moving fast. They're dealing with domestic political issues, but they're working hard to bring new solutions into these markets.
Now, Jim, you've signed a letter to a number of companies. We have a copy of it over on the side there, a number of other environmentalists as well, asking companies to support a price on carbon, thanking those companies that have. And there's quite a list of companies that have supported a price on carbon, so they're following the example that Scott mentions. But there's also a few that have not supported a price on carbon. How are you moving forward on this politically? How are you working with companies and conservatives and others to try to advance the ideas?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think that the solution is in fact consistent with conservative principles. In fact, there's an organization called Republicans for the Environment. The head of that organization read some of the articles I wrote about fee and dividend, and he wrote an article in which he endorsed that concept and pointed out that it was consistent with conservative principles. It doesn't tell people that they have to use this kind of energy or they have to do that. It's allowing them to make their own decisions about what energies they will use, and if they want to waste their money, they're free to do that. But over time, most people will recognize the merits of clean energies, and so that was one example. Now, I think there may have been some pushback by the fossil fuel industry. Because I got disinvited from to giving the keynote talk at that organization. But now, more recently, I have gone to Washington and talked and spoken about this at the weekly meeting that Grover Norquist has. And he's the
anti-tax champion, really the leading.
He's the leading conservative. And I think that we do have to get the conservatives to understand that if we don't take action, I mean, we can, for a limited time, we can deny the reality of climate change. But as Mother Nature, as it becomes more and more obvious, if conservatives continue to deny that, then we will reach a point where we have the equivalent of Pearl Harbor. You know, there will be climate disasters and people will demand that things be done, and then people will lose their liberties because the government will take over and try to institute policies. So it's much better to recognize this at the beginning and let conservative principles be used to move us off of our dependency on fossil fuels by putting a gradually rising fee on them.
Rob, is that?
Well, let's be clear about how this works, and then we can see who actually opposes it and who doesn't. This is an excise tax. It will virtually all be passed on in prices.
Exactly, that's the idea.
Wait a minute. And right, that is the idea. In order to put the country on a path that would lead to a sustainable level of greenhouse gas emissions that is sustainable with respect to the concentrations in the atmosphere, we're talking about, and it would be phased up, we're talking about between an average of, in 2005 dollars, $1,500 to $1,800 per household in additional energy and energy-related costs. Exxon knows it's going to pass this on and knows that oil is still going to be used because we have a fleet of automobiles that depends on it, and they understand that there's also that conservation will reduce that. That's fine. They have a global market. The coal industry knows this will reduce the use of coal by probably 50%. The coal industry is adamantly opposed to this. The political barrier here is not, frankly, K Street, though K Street does lots of terrible things. The political barrier is, how do we explain and how do we offset for an average American family an increase in their costs of $1,500 to $2,000 a year? Now, one way to try to reduce that is all the things that Bobby talked about. That is conservation and investments in alternative fuels. And in that regard, I just want to say that we have a presidential debate tonight. The single most underestimated piece of legislation of the last 10 years was the Stimulus Act, which included $90 billion in new support for alternative energy technologies, which included the first investments in a new grid so that, in fact, we could, people can conserve in a much more efficient way. It's there's a new book out called The New Deal by Michael Grunwald of Time magazine, which makes this argument very effectively that it is a really transformative piece of legislation. But the fact is, we have to do all that because the Congress will not pass legislation, no matter how much they believe in climate, that the public will then say, you have increased my cost by what?
Jim, the public will be the biggest supporter. Let me give you specific numbers. If we use the John Larson tax rate, which is $15 a ton, going up $10 a ton, at the end of 10 years, it's $115 a ton. That's $1 a gallon on gasoline. At the current fossil fuel use in the United States, that would generate $600 billion a year. You distribute that to the legal residents of the country, it's between $2,000 and $3,000 per legal resident per year. That's a lot of money. And their energy prices will go up, other prices will go up, everything that uses energy will be affected in a proper way. The economy will make those decisions. 60% of the people will get more in this dividend if you give the money to them. Don't let the government say, I'm going to invest this in solar panels or anything else. The marketplace will make those decisions. But the public, most people will get more in the dividend, and at the end of 10 years, our carbon emissions would be reduced 30%, which is 10 times more than the amount of carbon carried by the Keystone XL pipeline. So it's the sensible way to solve our energy problems rather than going out and drilling for tar sands oil. And if this were explained to the public, then they can understand this, and it's to their benefit and it's to their children's benefit. What we need is some honest politicians who will stand up and explain the situation to them. And there's no reason why you can't get this to work, and it's a conservative approach. It's consistent with conservative principles.
Bobby, how do we get this done?
Yeah, I again would disagree with Bob. I'm sorry.
I expected.
I think this is a sort of a classic pitfall of looking at the cost of environmental regulation without looking at its benefits or without really understanding the vast domain of alternatives. Oil can't pass their excise tax on to the rest of us if we have alternative forms of energy that become economical when oil hits $75 a barrel, which we do. Now, we have in our portfolio 2 electric car companies. To drive an electric car, from the beginning, including the cost of the car, costs about 6 cents a mile. It costs 60 cents a mile to drive an internal combustion engine. So, the market is going to drive us there in one way or the other, just the rational market drivers. The question is the incumbents and the incumbents at this point have power to stop that from happening, but gradually that's going to erode. We have a company called Switch, which was on the cover of Wired magazine a couple of months ago. There's 1,000 LED light bulb companies in the world. About 750 of them are in China. But we believe that we've picked the one that's going to be the Google of that space. It will be available in every Best Buy in 2 months at a cost of $15 for a 60-watt bulb. An Edison bulb costs 79 cents. But an Edison bulb uses $14 of energy a year. Our bulb only uses $1. Our bulb will last for 30 years. An Edison bulb will only last for 1 year. So if you look at those costs over the year, and within 6 months, our bulb's going to be down to $6 a bulb. So in 6 months, you make up your money. We have technological alternatives out there, like wind, like the plants that we're building, like solar, and electric cars, LED light bulbs that are going to make it really difficult for the carbon cronies and the incumbents to pass new costs on to the American public, because there's other places they can go to get that energy or just stop using it.
I'd like to thank our panel. I think we are out of time, but I want to thank our great panel for a discussion this morning. Richard.
How about another big round of applause for Bill Shireman for doing a great job moderating what I know was a very robust and wonderful conversation. Gentlemen, thank you all for participating in today's discussion.